Okay, my name is Clem. I think I'm trying to say maybe I'm a contemporary post-colonial African artist. And one of the reasons why I say that is because much of my writings and my work is to try to provide alternative narratives to European narratives. So the way Europeans and Europe represented different continents of the world, or say, let's say, Asians, Caribbeans, and so my work tried to provide alternative narratives, and that's what post-colonialism does. So that's how both my theory and my works are represented. So today I'm just going to be talking briefly about my art and my research. I'll try not to talk so much about theory. I'm going to talk a bit of theory, just how it fits into practice. The majority of my theoretical work, I'm not just going to talk about it. I'm just going to talk basically about my practical work. Now, I did an undergraduate, a 5-year undergraduate program in visual art and technology, and I specialize in sculpture. Now, for those of you who are in art and design, you know that there are 3 different theories about art and design. So one of it is the aesthetic theory of art, where aesthetic is the main concentration of what is considered as art. Another one is what they call the content theory of art. So the ideologies behind the art is far more important than its visual configuration. And there's what they call institutional theory of art. This is where a particular institution defines what art is all about. So for instance, if you have a museum of contemporary art, they tell you, we want this kind of art, it must be contemporary, which means ethnographic art cannot come into that. So in the 1900s, you had art saloons in France and many parts of Europe, so they defined what art should look like. So that's what they call the institutional theory of art. But the way I was trained through the aesthetic theory of art, so what they call creative pedagogy. So the essence of art then was just to create things that look beautiful. So nobody was interested in what's the meaning of what you've created, but so long as it looks beautiful and you use art to represent something. So, but if it must look aesthetically pleasing, that's when your lecturers gives you high marks. So I was trying to create things that look this way. I still make them when I have the time. Just like when I'm relaxing, I can still create things. So whether it's painting, whether it's drawing, whether it's textile, whether it's sculpture, whether it's metal, wood, the essence was to make them look extremely beautiful, and that's when your lecturers are going to give you the marks. However, at the end of my second year, something happened, and the 2 professors were sent on sabbatical to my university back in Africa. And one of them had a very big studio, he had a big studio and had connections with those in authority, those in government. And they gave him lots of commissions, and then he employed me to work in his studio, which means from the end of my second year, I had this first hand of working with commissions. So I was introduced to start working with public commissions, whether they're in outside space, on big hotels or government buildings. So I had that first experience. Now the next thing that happened was that the second professor introduced me to 2 philosophers. And one of the philosophers is Ezra Pound. And when I read into Ezra Pound's writing, Ezra Pound says that art is like a fountain rising and falling under the varying pressures of social conditions, blown into an infinite sequence of forms by the winds of destiny. The second philosopher is Eugene Clement. Has anybody heard of him? Now, in theoretical perspective on Western art history, Eugene Clement says that the work of art is symbolic, and there is a visual metaphor, and there is a visual documentation of the social, political, and cultural context and conditions that gave rise to it in a particular time frame or in a particular context. What it says, we know about Greek, for instance, we know lots about Greek, not just because of the writings of Greek, but if you look at Greek art, the development of Greek art from archaic period down to the Hellenistic period, you can use the visual configurations of the art to define the particular context and time frame of that history. And that's because the art seemed to record the philosophies and the cosmology of the people at the time. And that's why you could be able to read the history of the people through the visual configuration of the art. Now, this completely changed the way I started looking at art. So I was like, no, art can't just be about aesthetic alone. I started looking at art from a very ideological perspective. Now, I started looking at art, one, as something that is a reflection of the society, as a reflection of a society where it is conceived, and it becomes a record of the context and the time frame of that society at the time. I also started looking at art as something that is defined by socio-political and socio-political circumstances. And finally, I started looking at art as the creation of artifacts directed towards addressing such socio-political conditions that gave rise to its formalism. Now, these two theories that I encountered at the end of my second year completely changed the way I started looking at art. And one of the reasons why these theories resonated very strongly with me at the time was because in Nigeria, even now, all the paints, all the canvas, the pigments you use in paintings or drawings, we all import them from Europe. And it's very expensive to buy the materials. And at the end of my second year, when you're in second year, you have to specialize in a particular field. So I was meant to specialize in either painting or graphics. But there's no how my family could provide the money for me to buy those materials. So I couldn't specialize in paintings or graphics. And I discovered that the reason for that was because of politicians, because they're so corrupt. And they make it incredibly difficult for other people to get money. And so I decided to specialize in sculpture. The reason is because when I looked at the sculpture unit, the students could just pick materials around and create their work and still pass. Or they could go to the bush and cut logs of wood and carve it and still pass. So I went to specialize in sculptures, and how my art completely changed from aesthetic to something that's completely different. In one of the exhibitions that I entered, you can see a very big difference from the first image that I showed to you guys and what started happening to my art. So one of the exhibitions that I entered in 2006, I created this piece which I call National Conference. I don't know, I'm sure you guys do it over here as well, because every year you find we have about 56 or 70 political parties in Nigeria. So every year they go for what they call National Conference. You had it here with the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. When I see these people going to this conference, I see them as it's just a pilgrimage of selfish, self-centered people. That's exactly who they are, and that's what they do. So they go to plot on how to oppress the masses more and not to better the society. That's how I look at this national conference. I decided to use the symbolism of the spider because I've never seen two spiders before. Have you seen them? Spiders are very self-centered and individualistic. So they set up their net, catch their food and eat it, and wait for the next one. And that's exactly how politicians are. So I see them as a pilgrimage of very self-centered people going to the center of a particular state to have these meetings on how to continue oppressing other people. I had a commission in 2007 to create a public sculpture in a particular public space. And I submitted these drawings to them. The piece is very big. It's about 13 feet high and 11 feet long. And I created it through welding. I don't know if any of you can weld. So through welding. And what I did was I called the piece Beast of Burden, because one of the things I discovered was because of economic hardship, it was very difficult for people to sustain their families. And to an extent, even as I'm talking to you now, the minimum wage in Nigeria is 18,000 naira. That's about 25 pounds for a month. That's the minimum wage for a month, is 25 pounds. And if you've got a man that has 7 kids and 2 wives, how do you feed your family with it? You see, this is exactly what I'm saying. So one of the things I saw is that no matter how the person struggles in life, all it does is he just fetches scrap. And then you're forced to pick up the scrap that falls off from politicians and leaders' tables to be able to sustain your family. And I created this piece. I just thought that man has become a beast of burden as a result of economic hardship. So what I did was to go around, as soon as the drawings were approved, I went around mechanic workshops and picked motor parts, machine parts, and every kind of metal I can find, and got to my studio and started welding them to create this composition. Now, one of the biggest pieces that I created as an undergrad is this one. And I had a senior lecturer I worked in his studio, and we were given this commission to create this piece. Now, these huts were 50 of these huts, and we're meant to carve the doors, the windows, and the pillars. So each hut had 2 doors and 2 windows. So we were meant to carve 100 windows, 100 doors, and about 150 pillars. Now, what we did, we decided to look at this idea of cultural revivalism, because at the time, the government of my state borrowed 250 million from the US to create this massive, monstrous, what they call resort. It's the biggest in the whole of Africa. It's fantastic, don't get me wrong, but I don't like it because I mean, the money he borrowed 10 years ago, they're still paying it till now. They haven't even finished paying it. And one of the things that was really concerning was the fact that it's as if they uprooted a city from the West and planted it in an African context. It doesn't really fit in. And we're trying to make this statement through this piece. So let me show you the other picture so you understand what I'm saying. So you see, this is the monstrosity they created in the name of a resort. So there's all kinds of Western theme parks, there's cowboys and dinosaurs and hotels, and it's massive and beautiful. But the problem is, there's this element of cultural destruction by this aping of Western culture. One of the questions I asked them was, what's the essence of building a theme park in Africa with dinosaurs, cowboys, and all kinds of things that are Western in the name of drawing Western tourists? They've seen this in their country. So let's have something Africa. So when we're giving this commission, you can see the kind of contrast we're trying to create. So by creating these things that were completely African within the context of this monstrous development, you can see the kind of contrast. So when people come, you want them to see these wonderful things and also see this African theme, because each of the windows had a separate African theme, whether it's dance, whether it's music, whether it's African food, whether it's African language, ideographs. We try to bring them to create different compositions in each of the window and each of the pillars so people can see that contrast and that difference. And the essence was to bring about some kind of cultural revivalism, so it doesn't look as if the entire culture of the place is being destroyed by politicians who are trying to make a name for themselves. Now, when I finished my undergraduate studies, we have what they call a National Youth Service. So they can post you to anywhere, any part of the country. You can work for 1 year as a paramilitary or whatever. Then after that, I started lecturing back in the department, and I proceeded to come here to do my master's degree. Now, when I did my master's, I started exploring the idea of hybridism, appropriation, and upcycling. So for those, hybridism is this idea of cultural interaction. So I say how these interactions that happens between 2 or 3 different cultures. So what does it mean? How does it change the way we look at people from different parts of the world? If I, for instance, appropriate elements from Dutch culture and that from those from Switzerland, and use that to create a wonderful textile design or fabric and give it to a lady from Kent to wear it. So what dialogue will it create? This is the kind of things I looked at when I did my master's. I also look at this idea of upcycling. Upcycling is the transformation of objects from the original value to something of higher value. So that's the difference between recycling. So if I recycle this laptop, it's going to be a laptop again. But if I upcycle it, this could become a piece of fabric. So Lady Gaga could wear it or something. So that's the difference. So that's just I started looking at them as conceptual frameworks for the invention of new approaches to contemporary expressionism. Now, towards the end of my AMS studies, I started interrogating found object in depth. And looked at avant-garde, looked at appropriation and ready-made in relation to the phenomenon of modernism. Now, one of the things I found out is that the concept of the found object is directly linked to Western modernism, and that there are cultural peculiarities not yet established in art history. If you type found object, it talks about Marcel Duchamp. I don't know if you've ever tried that before. Say, it talks about Marcel Duchamp, it talks about Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, it talks about Vladimir Tatley, it talks about Andre Breton. So I started working with the found object without reading about these guys. So I never knew these guys existed. But I started working with the found, so I started seeing possibilities that the rationale why I was using the found object is completely different from why people like Picasso use the found object. So I saw possibilities of cultural peculiarities which nobody in art history has ever written about. I said, okay, this could be a good area to look at. Another thing that I discovered when I started towards the end of my master's program is the fact that the construction of modernism is Eurocentric and problematic. So if you type, I'm sure all of you have done assignments of modernism here. Has anybody done that? Fantastic. So when you type modernism, if you start researching into modernism, it tells you about Paris, post-war England, it tells you about Zurich, it tells you about New York, so it tells you about St. Petersburg. This is how it tells you about Russia. It never tells you that there was modernism in the Caribbean. It never tells you that there was modernism in India. It never tells you that there was modernism in Africa. This is the Eurocentrism that I'm talking about. So is constructed and defined in such a way that it just talks about Europeans, but there are other modernisms that nobody talks about. And then I started seeing all these possibilities, and I decided to do my PhD research in Nigerian modernism and the cultural ramifications of the found object in art. It's very long and boring anyways. Now, I'm not going to talk about my research. I'm just going to talk about how issues from my research fed into the works that I created in my last exhibition. Now, one of the issues I found from my research, because I had to look at the development of the history of Western occupation of Nigeria from 1945 to 1965. I had to read through all of that and see how art played and how cultural interactions and how cultural impositions played out as well. One of the issues I found out is that colonial ambiguity and hybridity created crisis of identity and cultural fragmentation in Africa. So if you've read about colonialism, what happens is that the West goes into a culture as a superior civilization and impose its cultural values on the colonized and forces the colonized to copy its own ways. Now, this is what happens. You have people who, this is the indigenous culture, and this is the Western civilization. By forcing them to copy Western ways, it creates an interstitial space and culture that exists in between primitivism and civilization. So the identity of these people is lost because they are no longer indigenous and they are not actually civilized Western people. So they exist in between, so they have this crisis of identity. Another thing I found out is there's neocolonialism. I don't know if you've heard of neocolonialism before, anybody? Now, neocolonialism is the continuous oppression and domination of former colonies or third world countries by the West after the end of colonialism. So America still controls Africa, even as we're talking now. Britain still controls Africa. It controls the politics, economics of Africa, even as we're talking now. Now, but there's something I discovered. The worst part of neocolonialism is when Africans colonize Africans. So when Pakistanis colonize Pakistanis, or when Indians colonize Indians. So I call that phenomenon excessive individualism. So we have it in Africa. I'm going to talk about it much later. Another thing I found out is the challenges of modernity. And you will discover that for those of you who've read into modernism, modernism was more like a reaction, so artistic, scientific, or music, or any political reaction to industrial revolution, enlightenment, especially the information overload and the fragmentation of society. One of the things that artists really talked about is this replacement of man by machines. Did you read anything like that? Yeah, this replacement of man by machines. So man's identity was completely lost. So we see how I discovered that I see a lot of problems in terms of modern life. We still have some of those problems even now. Another thing I found out is the deceit of globalism. Now, see, it doesn't, to me, that's my interpretation, it doesn't exist. It's a cosmetic political construct that doesn't exist beyond its theoretical context. So, globalism is supposed to say we are this massive village, intercontinental, big village of people relating together, or universalism, we see everybody as the same, isn't it? But you grow beard and get on the train, and people are getting away from you. How do you say that is universalism? I'm going to talk about this much later, but that's my own perspective of what I think globalism is. And finally, also another issue that I found is the Eurocentric misconceptions about African art. One of the things that European writers say is that one of the reasons they say there was no modernism in Africa was because during the flourishing years of modernism, that was the peak of colonialism and imperialism. So they saw the colonizers not being capable, intellectually or creatively capable enough to create art that could be classified as modern. This is very funny. And then what they did was to develop two philosophies. One is primitivism and exoticism. So what happens is they say, oh, African art is primitive or is exotic. And when you use those two philosophies, you're trying to say that art is not sophisticated enough, is not changing, and that is a kind of art that is stumbled into without any kind of intellectual consideration. So these are very wrong philosophies and theories, and thank God some people are now changing them. Now, I've written about all of this, and I started asking myself, how do I create art that interrogates these ideas as well, beyond the theories that I've written? And I want to talk about When you talk about cultural fragmentation that I talked about, if you look at somebody like Homi Bhabha says that through imposition, colonialism created interstitial culture, space to culture, which was neither indigenous to the colonized nor to the colonizers. That's what happens in Africa now. If you go, I can't actually define what Nigerian culture is now. We were colonized by the British, and then by 1963 we copied American way of life. So it's really confusing. So if you go now, even the music, you can't tell what the music is. It's not an African music, it's not an American music, it's not Caribbean, it's just a combination of a very convoluted kind of, so there's this cultural fragmentation that I'm talking about that's caused by colonial imposition. Now in 2015, I was asking myself, how do I capture this essence, this idea of cultural fragmentation I'm talking about, to represent African culture as it is at the moment. And I created this piece, I call it Haze. That's something that's very difficult to understand what it is. And that's how the culture of Nigeria, for instance, is at the moment. And I created this piece by appropriating different kinds of found objects, wood I could find around, and then created this composition of assembled fragments to capture this sense of fragmentation I was talking about in terms of the culture. Now, after creating this piece, I read Immanuel Kant's theory, and Immanuel Kant says that beauty can symbolize presence, and that what you call ugliness or repulsion can symbolize this absence. And I decided to interrogate the same idea further, and I created this piece in 2016. I tried to use the form at the middle with some sort of scarifications and aesthetic appeal to it to represent this kind of presence that Immanuel Kant talks about, and I used the other forms that are not really aesthetically pleasing around it to represent the absence. And this is how I look at civilization in Africa at the moment, because there's sometimes people behave in such a way, oh, these people are really civilized. Then people start doing other things, and you say, these people are not really civilized. So what you have is a sense of civilization that is both present and absent at the same time, and it goes back to the cultural fragmentation that I was talking about. And then this is another piece that I created to try to interrogate that idea. One of the things you find out with my works is that when I'm interrogating a particular idea, I don't create only one kind of art. I create a series of art forms to try to interrogate that same idea. And again, after I used wood, and I said, okay, how do I interrogate the same ideas of cultural fragmentation using a different kind of art form? So instead of doing assemblage like I've done here, I decided to do carving. So I used a plaster of Paris to carve, again, this convoluted form using Immanuel Kant's theory of trying to adorn some side with some kind of aesthetic appeal and leave the other convoluted form to capture the sense of cultural fragmentation I'm talking about. And then also, one of the issues I found in my research, this idea of hybridity and synthesis, and I try to explore it in art and design generally. This idea that things can exist in between spaces, or can come together to change the way we look at it or the way we understand it. And I created one of these pieces. I think I created a series of these pieces that I called reinterpretation. So one of the things that I did with this piece is to go around building sites and collect some kind of what they call, how do they call this? Scaffolding boards. And then I bring them down back to my studio and start transforming them. But another thing that I do is that certain areas of the old wood that I found, I leave it that way to create this piece that exists. It changes the way we start looking at what we consider is discarded, or what we think is rubbish, and what we think is art. Another piece that I created using the same ideology is this piece. And this is reinterpretation too. Now what I did with this piece was to go around collecting all kinds of old wood, and I look at the markings on the woods, because when you see old boards or old wood, there are always some kind of markings caused by human or environmental interventions or wood termites. And I draw each of those markings I could find on a piece of paper, and I put the wood back in my studio, burn them, and start drawing those same markings on them, combine them with some African ideographs to change the context of the wood that at one point is discarded, and at another point it turns into a contemporary art form. Now, in this piece, I was trying to look at this synthesis, because in one of the articles I've written of recent, I talked about this idea that it's very difficult at the moment to try to categorize what you call contemporary art based on stylistic configuration, because artists and designers continue to transgress different genre boundaries. So they don't deal with a particular thing any longer. They keep going from one genre to the other. So I created this piece, created this textile, then I now created this fabric, designed this fabric, then created these sculptural forms, and then play with them together to create this piece that exists in between what you think is sculpture and what you think is textile. So this is the kind of question that I pose when I talk about interstice and hybridism. Now, one of this piece, I just call this piece 1908 because there's something that happened in 1908, and that was in 1908 the colonial officers imposed taxation in Nigeria and imposed tax on both men and women, and all the market women refused to pay the tax, but the men paid the tax. And they refused to pay the tax and decided to start rioting. And they won the battle because the tax was overturned, so they didn't pay the tax. Now, what is intriguing to me is not the battle itself, but the weapon used by the women during the battle. So they used their boobies. I don't know how the official term to call it anyway. You see, this is what I'm saying. So they just came out with no clothing, and they scare of people holding guns. You see, this interstice between beauty, nudity, and power became very, very interesting for me to look at, because in pre-modern African context, the absolute display of power is when women come out naked with no clothing. So in pre-modern context, for instance, if all the ladies, say 500 women now go to the mayor's office without clothing and tell the mayor to resign, he leaves the office without any question. That's how powerful, because in African cosmology, women are considered central to the continuance of humanity. So they are very, very powerful. So that's the weapon that they use. So I'm looking at this interstice between something that defines ideal womanly beauty in Africa, because you must have massive boobies and a big buttocks, and you're beautiful. That's how pre-modern ideal womanly beauty looks like. And then something that provides pleasure, whether man or woman, and something that nourishes humanity becomes a weapon for the dismantling of colonial imposition. It's that interstice that was very interesting to me that I created this piece. Another thing that I looked at is excessive individualism. I define excessive individualism as a phenomenon whereby a few privileged people they get into power through rigged political system, colonize the nation's wealth, manipulate the constitution to retain their power, and then use force and intimidation to hold their people in captivity under democratic dictatorship. And that's what we have in Africa at the moment. So you have it, lots of it in Africa. So you see one person is in power for 45 years. And the truth is, if you hold an election, if you organize an election tomorrow, he will still win. Because he owns the army, owns the place, owns the electoral system, owns every institution of government. So that's what we call, that's why I'm looking at excessive individualism, this idea that people have grown beyond their country. You can also see it with the American election that just passed. There's certain people that are beyond the Constitution, if you look at it. So this is excessive individualism I'm talking about. According to A.K. and Samba, it says colonialism implanted the notion that force was the acceptable instrument of rule, and Africa's bourgeois politicians operate ideologies rooted in colonial thinking, using force as weapons and mechanism for legitimating their hold on their own people. I was like looking, how do I capture this excessive individualism in contemporary society? And I created this piece. One of the things I've done in this piece is to use the simple mechanism of proportion and exaggeration. So I'm sure, through exaggeration you can make lots of comments, whether it is design or art or architecture, through simple proportion and exaggeration. So that's one of the things I've done here, to create this massive Thoron figure to represent the dictators in Africa at the moment. And you can see it in Nigeria, Egypt, whether it's in Kenya and whether it's in Somalia. You can find it in Tunisia as well. So we have these big problems, or what I call, it's a tragedy in contemporary society. So I created this massive figure to represent the political class, and then the masses who are reduced to almost infinitesimal position in social strata in society, who are meant to crawl on their bellies to beg politicians for survival. The truth is, if you don't do that, you might get arrested. You might get arrested. One of the things I was saying to some students last week, you see, we have a situation in Africa where a politician can come and take your wife, and you can hardly complain about it. Because if you earn £40 in a week, in a month, and then there's some guy that earns £500,000 in the same month, what chance have you got to defend him collecting your wife from you? This is because of excessive individualism. How many minutes more?
Oh no,
so this is the big problem. It's a very difficult situation. I'll give you another example. When I was finishing my undergraduate studies to go for service, I had neighbors. My neighbors, they had this young girl that was 14 years old, and by the time I got back from service, I met her in town, and she was driving a car that's like £70,000. That, you see, 500 because she's small, right? And then she's driving a car that's £80,000, and that's because a politician that is about 82 years old is dating her. And her father can't say anything. Her father can't say anything, and you don't have this kind of laws about pedophilia in certain African countries, so people can actually do what they like. So this is the problem with excessive individualism. Now, one of the things to talk about is idea of idealism of globalism. Now, Petito, Suzuki, they all say that globalism is an idealized political concept of convenience that barely extends beyond its theoretical context. If you say there's globalism, then there should be, there shouldn't be any borders, isn't it? I should be able to finish this talk now, carry my bags, and go to Lanzarote, have some fun, and then go to Germany after that, have some fun, and go to Russia, and enjoy myself, and go back to Kent, an island of white, and have fun where people will not look at you as a tourist attraction because you laugh. So this is what I'm trying to say. We should be able to move in between without any restrictions. But you can see it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. If you land at Heathrow, the first question they ask you is, when are you going back? This is what I'm trying to say. And universalism, again, is this idea we're supposed to accept everybody, isn't it? Yeah, like I said earlier, you grow beards, you get on the train, people are getting away from you. Or you have 3 ladies wearing hijab, they get on the lift, and a Chinese guy comes and sees them, he decides to use the stairs. What are you saying? That's globalism and universalism. It's a very strong. Okay, let's use your former prime minister for instance. I've heard him giving this wonderful press conference where he talks about people should be accepted for who they are. You should accept people for wherever they come from, their religious. And then early this year, do you know what he told the Queen? He says that Nigerians are fantastically corrupt. This is the same person that just said last week that everybody is the same. That's the kind of thing I look at. I look at, see what we have in society, even in contemporary society, people are accepted based on their race, their color, and religious orientation even now. So my ability, for instance, to reside in any country in the world is still defined by your race and defined by your religious or political orientation. Now, these people are all beautiful, by the way. So this is the work that I'm talking about, this one here. What I've done with this piece is to appropriate matchsticks. So there's a lot of matchsticks that I've used, and I use matchsticks to represent every continent of the world. And within the dominant color of the matchsticks that represent a particular continent, I decide to install very small clusters of different matchsticks that represent other cultures and other civilizations. And I've done it in such a way that those ones that I installed in those places don't actually mix. That's exactly what we find in contemporary society. So, yeah, you might immigrate to a particular culture or country, but the possibilities of you actually mixing doesn't happen. So you have people dwelling in what they call migrant communities. Then what are you saying? What are you talking about globalism? This is what I'm trying to say. That's my view, that globalism doesn't actually exist. It's just a political construct. It's just a cosmetic political construct that politicians use to fool so many people, especially Africans. Because when you tell Africans that everybody's equal in the world, then they can do what they can allow you to do what you want to do, but it actually doesn't exist. Another thing that I looked at is this challenge of modernity. One of the things I found is it's just like the modernists in the 1900s complained. But one of the things they talked about, we still have that pressure of modern life. So what I find, one of the biggest challenges of modern life is economic constraint. And you see, our life, your life, my life, our lives are defined by our quest to gather wealth. So by coming to school, so you finish one day and you make money. By working, so that you make money. So we define even the way we interact with people. So we hardly say hi here for up to 2 minutes, for up to 2 seconds. Say, hiya, you go your way because you're rushing off to work to make your money. Now, these are receipts the shopping receipts that I collected over a period of 7 months. And when I look at them in my house, it shows this, and you stay in your house and see bills coming through your door. It's as if you're drowning. It's as if you're drowning in these bills. And because money is the password to enjoy modernity and contemporary lifestyle. That's how I look at it. You might be living in Luton, in a very modern society. If you don't have money, you can't enjoy that bliss or that what you call modernity or contemporary lifestyle. So that's how I look at it. I look at this constraint. Now in this piece I decided to combine, again, if you remember I was talking about indices. I decided to combine two different kinds of artistic genres. One is the ready-made. I'm sure you've heard of the ready-made by Duchamp. This idea of kind of picking ordinary things and changing their context by putting them in an art gallery. And combining the traditional method of modeling and casting to create this piece with this figure that seemed to be drowning in the tide of bills. And that's how I try to capture this essence of the price and the constraint of modern living. Now finally, one of the things I tried to do with my works, when I talked about Eurocentric misconceptions about African art and the African contemporary expressionism, this idea that contemporary African art is primitive or exotic, I try to deconstruct that ideological and cultural subjectivity by appropriating things that originally you would call primitive, and trying to change their context to become contemporary, to see how people are going to respond to it. And one of the things I started doing was to start looking at African ideographs. Ideographs were symbols that were used in, I don't know if you've seen certain Africans, they have markings on their body, on their face. So in traditional context, those scarifications were used as a mark of identity that you belong to a certain community type or a community place. And they were also used for what they call rite of passage. So if a girl becomes maybe 16 years old, they're going to draw these things on her body and then they initiate her to become a woman, all this kind of stuff. And so they were used as, they had this traditional meaning and people look at it as being primitive. Although now that has changed. I read a paper 2 years ago and somebody was saying that tattoos are the highest form of human expression. I said, what the hell is this person talking about? It's the same scarifications that made certain traditional people to be considered primitive. So what has changed between them? A lot has changed anyways between them. So what I do is to pick 1 or 2, 3, all the symbols, they have the meaning. So what I do is to pick maybe 3 of these symbols and I'll start working with those symbols. So what I do is to create different kinds of compositions or motifs, as they call it in textile. I'll create different kinds of motifs and then start repeating those motifs. Now, I start from here and I go here and I start creating things like this from these same symbols. So it's just from these symbols, I start working on them and I create different kinds of designs and create These all the same drawings from the symbols. I composed them into different kinds of patterns. And then I created this piece for those of you who were in this vision that I call New Realism. And the reason why I call it New Realism is because it exists in between. It exists in between two periods. So it exists in between what you call a primitive and what you call contemporary. So this juxtaposition or hybridity of two periods and two cultural forms to change the context. Because when people came to the exhibition, they didn't actually know exactly what was happening. But if you show them this, they'll tell you, oh, this is primitive stuff. And you show them this, I said, oh, this is a nice work of art. You see, this is how through very small amount of artistic or design alteration, you can change the context. You can deconstruct people's subjectivity or ideologies about a particular thing or a particular artifact. Now, my methodology is very simple. I'm sure every designer, they all have their own methodologies. Colin, everybody, they have their own different methodologies. You're going to develop yours if you haven't done that, but as you go along, you're going to develop yours as well. Mine is very simple. So my work is either influenced, as you've seen, by theories that I have read, or by socio-political issues that I'm trying to talk about, or they might be influenced by concepts or commissions given to me by politicians. So most of the commissions I've done as an undergraduate were actually given to me by politicians, even though they are very funny people. So, yeah, that's why I say you shouldn't record the first part, because I'm still going to be looking for commissions from them. You see, that's the truth. Anyways. So these four things are what influence my practice. It's either theories, socio-political issues, concept, or commissions. And then once I get that, what I do is I start doing what they call explorative drawing. So for instance, if I read a particular theory, I ask myself, how do I capture that theory in visual form? So I try to create all my works must start from drawing. Everything that I create always starts from drawing. So I try to explore those ideas with different kinds of drawings to see which one works out best. After that, I go into what I call experimentation. Now, during this phase, I try to test different materials. I try different, so I'll look at the 4 or 5 of the drawings and see, is it going to work well as a wooden sculpture, or as a plaster of Paris, or modeling? Is it going to work as textile design? So these are the kind of questions that I ask myself during this phase, and I make very small scales or models and see how it works out. And then once I choose the ones that I like, I go into the final production where I'm now really creating it in the scale that I want, and my works are always big, because size is very important to me. So come on, guys. Yeah, their size is very important to me to make the kind of statement I like to make. If you create something about politicians, for instance, or social commentary that is small, say, oh, it looks beautiful. But if it's massive, for instance, it occupies an entire city center, oh, what's happening here? So it changes the way. That's why size is important. But as soon as I get through this phase, I sit down in my studio again and start interrogating the outcomes. This is the funny thing that I do. When I create one piece of art about a particular concept or about a particular idea, I start asking lots of questions of the work that I've already created. And that's the reason why you see me creating one thing, and then it leads to another thing, and then my works keep going on and on. And then after that, it goes back again. So it's just a continuous process for me, and this is all about my own methodology as a maker, as an artist, or a designer. Oh, nice animation. Thank you.